Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. Now I came across this video just as I was finishing the last one, and I found it rather interesting. It's an interview by two atheists with Steve Shives from about 2 years ago, and I found the contrast between them very, very interesting. They seem to be very open-minded. Now to be fair, they have some misinformation, but they seem open-minded enough that I think if I had a chat to them, they would listen to my side. I might even change their mind, and I think we'd leave the conversation on friendly terms, which is, the complete opposite of Steve Shives. And this really comes across on his face during numerous parts of the interview, where one host will say something which is fairly open-minded and reasonable, and Steve will pause and pull a bit of an uncomfortable face, and he's really not sure what to say to it. So I thought it might be interesting to go through and have a look at this and compare it to some of the recent things that Steve Shives has said.
Why don't we move on to another subject now? And this is, I've seen a bunch of your videos at this point. Most of them have, really nice approval ratings. The ones that don't are the ones that go after the men's rights movement.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that a little bit. First of all, what's your position on that, and what kind of response have you gotten?
Well, my response from people who are fans of the men's rights movement has been very negative, because my opinion of the men's rights movement is about as negative as my opinion can be of anything. I hold them beneath contempt because I think that they're a hate group. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. And I think that they're even worse because they exploit the concerns of legitimate, men who maybe are having trouble or vulnerable or who have been abused or whatever, and they pretend to care about those issues to give themselves a veil of legitimacy, when in fact I think if you look at the groups that comprise the men's rights movement fairly, they really don't seem to ever do anything about these issues that they claim. Yeah.
Now you'll note when Steve talks about the men's rights movement, he does so in very broad terms. He says the numerous groups, but he never names the groups. So we don't know specifically what he's talking about. For all we know, he could be talking about Roosh V and Return of Kings, right? I mean, it's pretty fucking common for people like Steve to use pickup artists as an example of MRAs. In fact, Steve's even linked to articles before which do this. So because Steve never gives any actual examples to back up his claims, it makes it extremely difficult to falsify those claims. And I suspect that this is something he does on purpose. Of course, it also means he makes incredibly weak arguments. But that doesn't matter to Steve because he's preaching to the choir. He's not trying to convert people, he's preaching to his audience, which already have these biased viewpoints.
So they're dishonest and they're exploiters of the very people that they claim to be advocating for. I have nothing but disgust for them.
But when it comes to the actual tenets, and you're looking through, one of your videos did talk specifically about hey, a lot of people who agree with the points don't want to identify with men's rights movements because of the culture. Although you agree with a lot of the points that they have written down.
Yeah. Well, there are two groups that I think we need to draw a line between. There are legitimate activists, many of whom are feminists, who work to help vulnerable men, who run shelters, who run helplines, who facilitate maybe if a man is in an abusive relationship, how he can get help, how he can call the police, how he can get out of the house. It's the same thing that are done for women if they're in a domestic violence situation. So there are those people. And they don't want to be associated with the men's rights movement because of the stink on it.
Do you think, Steve, that maybe that stink on it, as you put it, is because of dishonest assholes like you? The type that work in the media and who constantly spread bullshit about the men's rights movement? The ones who claim that we're pick-up artists or that spree killers are members of the men's rights movement and influenced by them? Or that we're pro-rape or anti-women or want to go back to the 1950s, or that we think we're oppressed, or that women don't have issues, or we're misogynists, or we're white nationalists, or Nazis, or whatever the fucking latest thing is. The same type of shit that you spew all the time, Steve. Do you think maybe that bullshit would have some kind of influence on how people perceive the movement, as opposed to what the actual movement actually is. Just a question, mate.
And then there's another group of people who basically are functioning as men's rights activists, but they deny that they are men's rights activists.
Now that's very interesting. Let's see if we can find a bit of hypocrisy in Steve's argument, shall we?
Number 5, trolls blame Black Lives Matter for brutal kidnapping. Some of Milo Yiannopoulos' equally deplorable peers, who for reasons which escape me have not yet been banned from social media, have been blaming Black Lives Matter for the brutal abduction and beating of a disabled white man by 4 black 18-year-olds last week, a crime which was live-streamed by one of the perpetrators. None of the 4 suspects has any connection to Black Lives Matter, nor was their crime committed in the name of that movement. So, what possible connection could there be between these 4 black suspects and Black Lives Matter?
And then there's another group of people who basically are functioning as men's rights activists, but they deny that they are men's rights activists.
Why are so many status quo warriors blaming this on Black Lives Matter? I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm gonna say racism? The people who are seeking to use this terrible crime to discredit Black Lives Matter are a bunch of fucking piece of shit racists? Just a guess.
They say all the same things that men's rights activists always say. They make all the same arguments. They parrot all the same talking points, but they'll say, now, I'm not a men's rights activist.
Now, the reason why some people were suggesting that the 4 kidnappers were members of BLM is because they sound like they were members of BLM. They were saying things like, fuck Trump and fuck white people, which just so happens to be fairly common BLM talking points. I mean, look at this lovely example from Canada. This is one of the leaders of BLM in Canada. He was coming out with some amazing anti-white stuff. So it's perfectly understandable that some people might jump to the conclusion that the 4 kidnappers were at very least influenced by BLM. But I tell you what, I happen to agree with Steve. We shouldn't go around claiming that they were members of BLM or influenced by BLM unless there's actual proof. Sounds like therefore must be is not a good argument. And all I'm asking is that people like Steve give us the exact same consideration, which of course they never do. It's often claimed by people like Steve that these people who don't identify as MRAs use all the exact same talking points as MRAs, while at the same time they claim that these people don't talk about men's issues. Do I really need to point out that if someone doesn't identify as an MRA and they're not talking about men's issues, then you would have to be a fucking moron to think that they're an MRA? I mean, what criteria are you suggesting makes them an MRA? The fact that they sound like this stereotype of an MRA you've created in your head, right? So let's ask the question, does Steve actually know what an MRA is? Well, here's Steve talking about MRAs.
What I said was that the attitudes that are supported, that are defended, that are justified and rationalized by the men's rights movement, the sort of macho attitude that men are supposed to be the tough guys, men are supposed to be the protectors, the breadwinners, the fighters, etc., and if you get your ass kicked by a girl, that means you're less of a man. Or if you feel intimidated by a girl, or if a woman is able to put you in some sort of a vulnerable position, that somehow you're less of a man and you ought to be ashamed of that. Those are the sorts of attitudes that I suggested might be responsible for the incidents of male victimized domestic abuse not being reported, if indeed there are that many.
Oh, I see. So the men's rights movement puts forward macho fucking stereotypes of men which stop male victims from coming forward. Really, Steve? Really? Could you give us some examples of MRAs who do that? Oh, sorry, I forgot, Steve. You don't use examples because that way it would be easy to debunk you as a fucking liar, wouldn't it? Now, I think it's pretty obvious that Steve isn't talking about men's rights activists here. He's most likely talking about some other aspect of the manosphere, possibly the pickup artists. Or maybe just a stereotype he's created in his head from reading too much bullshit from the feminist media. I mean, who knows, really? But let's play a little game. Let's play a little game called Let's Use Steve's Own Standards on Steve and see what we get. So using Steve's own standards against him, I'm about to prove that Steve actually hates trans people. Now, this is obviously illogical because Steve is a big supporter of trans rights. But remember, we're not using logic and reason, we're using Steve's own standards. And remember, if it sounds like it must be exactly the same, right? That's the criteria that we're using. So we know Steve believes in patriarchy theory, and we know that trans exclusionary radical feminists also believe in patriarchy. Maybe that's just a coincidence though, right? But we know Steve believes in rape culture, and the TERFs also believe in rape culture. And we know Steve identifies as a feminist, and obviously the trans exclusionary radical feminist also identifies feminist. I'm starting to see a pattern here. It sounds like they've all got the exact same arguments, that there's absolutely no difference whatsoever. Gee, Steve must really hate trans people, right? Of course, this is bullshit because I'm cherry picking. It would be simple to point out, as I mentioned earlier, that Steve is actually a supporter of trans rights, and therefore he doesn't have everything in common with TERFs, right? There's a big difference between Steve and what he believes and TERFs and what they believe. But that actually requires being honest and seeing nuance and not seeing the world in black and white, and understanding that there are different opinions in different groups and that they shouldn't all be lumped together. Of course, doing that would make it a lot harder for Steve to actually make an argument against us. Wouldn't it, Steve? And I personally would argue that Steve Shives and TERFs have far more in common than MRAs and pickup artists. In fact, probably the only thing that MRAs and pickup artists have got in common is we disagree with feminist ideology, and even that we disagree on to some degree. But let's continue.
As though that gives them a little bit more credibility. But when you look at everything they're saying, it's really a meaningless distinction.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of a walks like a duck type situation.
Why are so many status quo warriors blaming this on Black Lives Matter?
But when you look at everything they're saying, it's really a meaningless distinction.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of a walks like a duck type situation.
And I think that there is a medium there of like feminists who aren't radical, but in my opinion, I've come across a lot of really radical feminists who everybody rolls their eyes at too. So yeah. I think that like there's a lot of comparisons.
I have to play that again because I love the little noise Steve makes and the expression on his face when she suggests that some feminists might be radical. It's so fucking funny.
I've come across a lot of really radical feminists who everybody rolls their eyes at too. So yeah. I think that like there's a lot of comparisons in the way that these two groups of people behave. These radical feminists and these radical men's rights movement.
Well, I disagree with that a little bit. I mean, I don't disagree that there are extremist feminists. Clearly, there are men and women. Well, I mean, I have no problem with the concept of a patriarchy, but no, there are extremists within the feminist movement, and there are problems with the feminist movement that you can find easily. Just ask a feminist. Feminists are very good at pointing out the elements in their own movement that they happen to disagree with. It's not a monolithic movement at all.
Yeah, I've heard Steve make this nonsense argument before, right? It basically goes, feminists criticize other feminists, so we don't need an outside force like the anti-feminist to criticize us because we're self-policing, right? Now, this is fucking nonsense. Let me use an example that an atheist like Steve should understand. Now, there are lots and lots of different Christian groups, and they often criticize one another. Therefore, using Steve's logic, we can suggest that there's no need for an atheist movement, right? Now, there's an obvious fault in this logic, and that is that Christians all have one common thing that they all believe in, and that is the belief in the Bible and the resurrection of Christ and everything that goes along with that, right? That is their cornerstone. They may disagree on many, many other things, but they all agree on that one thing. And obviously, atheists don't believe in that one thing, right? We don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God and that Jesus was resurrected. Many of us don't even believe he existed. And we find a similar thing with feminism, right? Just about every single feminist believes in patriarchy theory. That is their cornerstone. The number of feminists who don't believe in patriarchy theory, I think I can count on one hand.
What I'm saying is these white middle-class women love this current brand of ideology because it allows them to explain their own weaknesses to the world. You see, it wasn't me at all. It was the patriarchy and all that crap. These words like patriarchy, which are meaningless, big fuzz words, okay? You know, I'm popping a lot of balloons, and that's one of them.
And that is one thing that anti-feminists strongly disagree with, the concept of patriarchy theory. So feminists can disagree about trans people and trans rights and whether trans women are actual women or men in dresses, as the TERFs like to say. And they can disagree about sex positive and sex negative and numerous other things. But ultimately, the vast majority of them believe in patriarchy theory. And because the vast majority of them all agree on patriarchy theory, you won't get any detailed or nuanced counter-arguments to the theory of patriarchy theory. Because doing so, they would essentially be arguing against their own cornerstone. Just like Christians typically don't argue that Christ never existed or he's a myth, because that would be arguing against their own faith. This is why it's important to have outside groups offering counter-arguments. Even if you disagree with those counter-arguments, even if you think those counter-arguments are bullshit, it doesn't hurt to have counter-opinions. This prevents the creation of echo chambers. If there is a blind spot in someone's belief system, then having a counter-movement or an outside force which isn't restricted by the beliefs of the group means that it can point out any blind spots that might exist within the belief system. And if there are no blind spots, if the belief system is actually correct and without fault, then you shouldn't be afraid of having an outside force or influence criticize your belief system. In fact, it should make it stronger. But when you only have internalized criticism, that's when you create echo chambers. That's when you become more extreme and more radical. Anyway, let's continue.
But when people try to make the comparison and say, well, there's extremists in feminism and there's extremists in the men's rights movement too, my question has always been, where are the non-extremists in the men's rights movement? Where are the reasonable people?
Now, my question for Steve would be, how exactly do you define extremist? Now, I suspect his answer would be anyone who disagrees with feminism, and we'll see why in a little while. But I think that's all that's required to be labelled as an extremist by Steve Shives.
They're not in the movement.
They're not in the movement.
Yeah.
And many of the ones who claim to not be in the movement but are of that second type that I just talked about are just as extreme as the ones who claim the title of men's rights activist.
Why are so many status quo warriors blaming this on Black Lives Matter?
I think the issue is that, well, I mean, I don't think it's an issue necessarily. Feminism has a longer history, and they actually legitimately had really big issues to conquer in the past. Yes. And I personally consider myself more of a libertarian feminist, if that. And a big part of that is I feel like a lot of the changes that we need to make now have to do with women's whether or not women are choosing certain opportunities, because I feel like there's a lot of opportunities that haven't been there in the past. Yeah. And so I do take issue with a lot of radical feminists. Any feminist who says that my personal decision should be about women.
Right.
Like I'm autonomous, and I think that can be my issue about feminism. And sometimes I feel like it does ignore men's issues. So anyway,
There's that look from Steve again, and the little noise he makes when he doesn't know what to say. Let's have a look at that again.
Like I'm autonomous, and I think that can be my issue about feminism. And sometimes I feel like it does ignore men's issues. So anyway, we can have a huge debate about this.
No, and I say one thing.
Let's just make the rest of the show about this.
No, we're not going to get stuck on this, John. But one thing I noted about your video is you take pains at the beginning to introduce some nuance and say here are some specific things that are legitimate. You know, men don't get custody, you know, as easily, and that should be looked into. Men might have to go, and this isn't so true now, but like for military service, it was an extra thing that they had. You know, violence does happen against men, and it's not like Steve or anybody else is saying, hey, we shouldn't address this.
Right.
Well, actually, there are a lot of people who are saying we shouldn't address these issues. Typically, these people are called feminists. Just try talking about the issue of male suicide and see what kind of reaction you get. In fact, I recently saw a TED Talk by Cassie Jaye where she kind of summed it up perfectly.
Well, luckily, while I was making the Red Pill movie, I kept a video diary, which ended up tracking my evolving views. And in looking back on the 37 diaries I recorded that year, there was a common theme. I would often hear an innocent and valid point that a men's rights activist would make, but in my head, I would add on to their statement a sexist or anti-woman spin, assuming that's what they wanted to say but didn't. So here are two examples of how that would go. A men's rights activist, an MRA, would say to me, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters for women in the United States, but only one for men. Yet multiple reputable studies show that men are just as likely to be abused. I would hear them say, we don't need 2,000 shelters for women. They're all lying about being abused. It's all a scam. But in looking back on all the footage I'd gathered of men's rights activists talking about shelters, and all the blogs they've written, and the video live streams they posted on YouTube, they're not trying to defund women's shelters, not at all. All they're saying is that men can be abused too, and they deserve care and compassion. Second example, a men's rights activist would say to me, where is justice for the man who was falsely accused of raping a woman? And because of this accusation, he loses his college scholarship and is branded with the inescapable title of rapist. I would hear them say, a woman being raped isn't a big deal. It's as if I didn't hear the word falsely accused of rape. All I heard was he was accused of rape. Of course, rape is a big deal, and all the men's rights activists I met agreed it is a horrible thing to have happened to anyone. I eventually realized what they're saying is they're trying to add to the gender equality discussion who is standing up for the good-hearted, honorable man that loses his scholarship, his job, or worse yet, his children, because he's accused of something he absolutely did not do. Well, I couldn't keep denying the points they were making. There are real issues. But in my effort to avoid agreeing with my enemy completely, I changed from putting words in their mouth to acknowledging the issue, but insisting they are women's issues. So here are two examples of how that would go. A men's rights activist would say to me, men are far more likely to lose their child in a custody battle. And I would counter, well, because women are unfairly expected to be the caretaker, it's discrimination against women that women get custody more often. Yeah. I'm not proud of that. Second example, an MRA would say to me, Men are roughly 78% of all suicides throughout the world. And I would counter with, but women attempt suicide more often. So It's not a contest, but I kept making it into one. Why couldn't I simply learn about men's issues and have compassion for male victims without jumping at the opportunity to insist that women are the real victims?
I don't get, rationally, why men's rights activists are so upset. I don't think that there is a rational basis for a political movement like this. And I've said this before, and people have accused me of being biased or being anti-male or being too pro-feminist or drinking the feminist Kool-Aid or whatever. You can point out to me areas where men have been mistreated in our society, where men have been mistreated by women, where men have suffered because of favoritism shown to women. And I don't deny that. But that doesn't mean that men as a class, as a category of people, are persecuted, much less persecuted by women. There's a difference between pointing out cases where men have been mistreated or pointing out areas of our culture where men fall behind women, and describing men as a whole as a persecuted class or a disempowered class or an underprivileged class. That is absurd. It's possible to point out areas where Christians are mistreated in our culture because of their Christianity. It's possible to point out areas where straight people are disadvantaged because of their sexuality in our culture. It's possible to point out areas where white people are disadvantaged because of their whiteness in our culture. None of that means that straight people, that white people, that Christians, that men are disadvantaged, underprivileged classes that require political movements to raise them up. It's absolutely absurd. And to compare the overall sufferings of men to the overall sufferings of women in our culture is not only absurd, it's offensive.
Well, after years of researching and fact-checking what the men's rights activists were telling me, there is no denying that there are many human rights issues that uniquely or disproportionately affect men. Paternity fraud uniquely affects men. The United States Selective Service, in the case of a draft, still uniquely affects men. Workplace deaths, disproportionately men. War deaths, overwhelmingly men. Suicide, overwhelmingly men. Sentencing disparity, life expectancy, child custody, child support, false rape allegations, criminal court bias, misandry, failure to launch, boys falling behind in education, homelessness, veterans issues, infant male genital mutilation, lack of parental choice once a child is conceived, lack of resources for male victims of domestic violence. So many issues that are heartbreaking if you are the victim or you love someone who is the victim of any one of these issues.
It's absolutely absurd. And to compare the overall sufferings of men to the overall sufferings of women in our culture is not only absurd, it's offensive.
It's just the men's rights movement doesn't genuinely seem so interested. It does seem like they seek cover. And so the people that go after you in their rebuttals to yours, and I tried to watch a couple times, it's so laced with vitriol and nastiness. And it's not just saying, here's some points that he makes, and here are the serious reasons I disagree. I'm not saying they wimpy, they can be firm, but it's just like spewing hate. And I wasn't moved by any, like, that's a great argument.
This is not a civil rights movement as it claims to be. This is a hate group, populated by resentful failures too weak to carry their own baggage. They're some of the most pathetic human beings known to me, and their only redeeming quality is that they're so much damn fun to smack around, which is fitting since most of them seem to think that's all women are good for.
Because he already acknowledged, here are the points that we all should be concerned about. And so I don't think that's what lies at the heart of it. And so I would say that in terms of radical feminists, I've always considered myself a feminist. I agree with 98% of the important planks that sort of make up the platform. The part that I now have a problem with is there is a group that if you're not willing to mouth the same rhetoric that I do, you're a misogynist.
Now, he makes an excellent point here. Just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean you should be labelled a misogynist. But let's have a listen to what Steve has to say about people he disagrees with.
There is a faction of atheists. And yes, they are most vocal online. They are most vocal on YouTube. And they aren't usually represented on stage at conferences, but they do go to conferences, who are absolutely reprehensible, who hold absolutely just unacceptable, inexcusably vile, toxic attitudes toward women, toward people of color, toward trans folks and gay folks, toward disabled folks, toward pretty much anybody that doesn't fit into whatever box they are in. They see atheism, organized atheism, public atheism, as this white, cishet male-dominated thing, and they're totally cool with that. They don't see a problem with that. They're not bothered by that at all. And, in fact, some of them, when they see that as being threatened, when they perceive someone trying to tear down one of their cishet white male atheist idols, they get kind of rowdy about it. They get kind of pissy about it. Those people are here. They've been here all the time. If you've ever been to a skeptical conference, a secular atheist conference, you've stood side by side with those people, whether you know it or not.
And that's really disturbing and really divisive, because I really do care about women's rights, and what more can I do? Yeah. So, I think that's a divisive element in the atheist movement right now that's become a problem.
Oh, definitely, definitely. The attitude toward women and the attitude toward the anti-woman or the anti-feminist elements within the atheist community is something that I am constantly shaking my head over.
Now, this is hilarious, and it's also very telling. The male host makes a point about being labelled a misogynist if you disagree with someone, when he's not actually a misogynist. He actually supports women's rights. And Steve responds by saying, oh, yes, I totally agree. There is an anti-women and anti-feminist element within atheism. That's not what the guy was talking about. He's talking about being mislabelled. He's talking about people using the term misogynist as a bludgeon to stop debate. But Steve responds to a totally different point, once again reinforcing the idea that, the atheist movement is just teeming with evil sexists who are lurking around corners ready to jump out and assault women at a moment's notice.
As a woman, though, I don't feel that. Maybe other women have that experience, and it's this widespread thing that I'm not getting, but I have never really experienced that, so...
Okay, so here we have a woman saying that she's never experienced the rampant sexism, which is apparently destroying the atheist movement. So how is Steve going to respond to this? Because basically the rampant sexism, which is destroying the atheist movement, is his whole argument. It's his bread and butter, basically. It's his shtick. He hasn't got an argument without it. So let's see how he mansplains to her.
It's widespread. I don't know if it's widespread in terms of number of people that feel that way. My friend and fellow YouTuber Christy Winters is a social scientist, and she has long suggested that somebody do a really serious survey of professing atheists to try and have some data on, are anti-feminist attitudes really that prevalent in the movement, or is it just a relative few people who are making a big noise? And I would love for somebody to do that. So there's an actual picture we can look at and say, okay, actually most atheists don't feel hostile toward feminism.
Okay, so we've gone from misogyny to misogyny and anti-feminism, and now we've come to just anti-feminism. So I think it's pretty clear based on this and numerous other things Steve has said in the past that he considers no difference between anti-feminism and misogyny. If you disagree with the feminist movement, then you are a woman hater in his mind. It's pretty simple. It's black and white to Steve Shives, which is an interesting double standard because he is openly anti-MRA, yet he doesn't consider that to be anti-male. Although Steve might point out that men do have issues, which he then dismisses a few minutes later. He says his disagreement with the men's rights movement is because of our actions and because of our words and because of some of the things that we believe in. Yeah, that's how I feel about feminism. I'm not against women's rights. I'm against the actions and the words and the ideology of feminism in particular. Feminism is not the only vehicle for women's rights, and you may argue it's against women's rights. It's against women's autonomy in many ways. You can't have autonomy without responsibility, and feminism tends to take away women's responsibility for their actions. You could also argue that large portions of feminism isn't really about women's rights, it's just about shitting on men. All of these are valid points, but Steve sees it in black and white. If you disagree with feminism, it's because you hate women and you want them in the kitchen, right? You want to go back to the 1950s. You want to chain women to the kitchen sink and have them making sandwiches all day or some such bullshit. So let's once again use Steve's own standards against him. And doing so, we can prove that Steve Shives is a homophobe. Now, once again, let me point out that I'm only doing this to make a point. I don't actually believe Steve is a homophobe, but if we were to apply the standards he uses against us towards him, then we can conclude that Steve actually hates gay men. So we know Steve Shives doesn't like Milo. He, in fact, hates Milo. Now, you could point out that the reason why Steve hates Milo is because he doesn't agree with what he said, he doesn't agree with Milo's actions, and he strongly disagrees with what Milo believes in. You know, the same reasons why people like myself consider ourselves anti-feminists, the same reasons why Steve is anti-MRA. But because we're using Steve's standards, we can ignore all that, right? We can just push that to the side and pretend it doesn't exist. And instead, we just come to the conclusion that the only reason that Steve disagrees with Milo is because Milo is gay and Steve hates gay men. It's much simpler that way. It's much simpler to use Steve's standards and just ignore counter-evidence and just jump to the conclusion that someone is a bigot. It requires less thinking and evidence, and, you know, it doesn't require you to be an honest person when you're making an argument. And you can just shout people down and call them a bigot, right? Much simpler, which is why Steve does it. But there's actually more evidence that Steve hates gay men. We've seen Steve before sticking up for Islam. He's spoken out numerous times against Islamophobia. Now, we could argue that maybe the reason why Steve supports Islam and speaks out against Islamophobia is because some people judge all Muslims based on the actions of a few Muslims. And that would be unfair, but we know Steve doesn't use that standard because he sees the entire manosphere as being one entity, which he then labels MRAs falsely. So we know that Steve doesn't like nuance, and that the argument that maybe all Muslims aren't the same, you know, really wouldn't hold water to Steve, unless, you know, he's a massive fucking hypocrite, of course. So why would Steve support Islam then? Why would Steve defend Islam? Well, the only conclusion we can come to is because they like to throw gay men off the top of buildings. Now, of course, this requires us to ignore evidence, which is, you know, inconvenient to the Steve is a bigot argument. But, you know, that's a lot easier than actually making an honest argument with a legitimate point, right? It's so much easier just to point the finger at someone and call them a bigot, right? I mean, that's why Steve does it, because it's simplistic. doesn't require honesty or evidence, and you can just demonize your opposition without making an actual argument.
Right, but almost even raising that issue of, hey, we should look at this and get some real data, there's a whole segment that's going to say, wait a second, we already told you there's one, and that's the problem. Like, we're genuinely interested in addressing this and fixing it, but we'd like to know more about it, and that shouldn't classify us as, misogynists and haters.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and I agree with him 100%. You should be able to discuss things without being called a bigot or a misogynist or some other fucking label which doesn't apply to you. But I guess it's a lot easier to attack the person than to attack the argument. Isn't that right, Steve?
Oh, no.
Except for Steve.
Yeah, well, call me whatever you want. But no, there are people who have the experience that you say you had where you don't really get it. It's not really a big deal.
A lot of really great MRAs, too.
Yeah, but I know a lot of women who say, I don't comment on YouTube videos that are published by atheists because I'm afraid of the abuse.
Okay, there's a lot of questions here about this statement. Do male atheists get abuse as well? If they do, is that a similar amount of abuse, or is it just towards female feminist atheists? What arguments are these abused women making? Is it because of their arguments, or is it just because they're women? Because I would think there's a big difference between those two. Are they actually getting more abuse, or do they just feel like they're getting more abuse? We've seen in the Pew research on online harassment that men get equal amounts of abuse online, in some cases more. Yet the research also shows that women are more likely to be affected by it, whereas men are more likely to ignore it. Possibly this is a factor. Or possibly we have another situation where people are exaggerating abuse to use it as a political weapon. Most likely it's some combination of all those things.
I hear that a lot. So it's not as if I can just say, well, it's, just a few people. It clearly is an issue. Now, whether it's an issue because there are a lot of angry anti-feminists, or if it's because there are just a few who are just really angry and have to swarm everything, it's kind of hard to tell. Hopefully it's... A
lot of extremism and loud voices are on YouTube, too.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's our medium.
Absolutely.
So that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, YouTube comments are the lowest form of communication.
For instance, Sargon of Akkad. I like listening to his videos. I think that he's, absolutely hilarious because he thinks the world's going to end and we're going to be a Marxist society because of feminists. But a lot of his points make sense, and when you get him off the cusp, actually having a conversation, he's very, very even. He's a little bit radical, but he's not. He doesn't hate women, and he's not like Teal Deer.
Which is Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad, one of the most disgusting human beings on the planet.
But at the same time, I kind of feel like sometimes, we get to see a lot of extremism on,
Oh, yeah. It breeds it. I mean, YouTube particularly, but the internet in general sort of amplifies the extremist voices. Yeah.
Like me!
So I'm being flashed one extra piece of data saying that the Pew Research Center says that 91% of custody cases are decided without interference of the court.
Yeah. Look, I've debunked this bullshit before. Obviously, if we're talking about a bias in the family court system, then we're only referring to cases which have actually been to court, right? We're not talking about the ones that haven't been to court. I think the analogy I used before is if someone was studying the survivability of plane crashes, then they look at the planes which have crashed and the number of people who have survived and the circumstances in which they've survived or died, right? What you don't do is you include data of planes which have taken off successfully, flown to their destination successfully, and landed without incident, because those planes haven't actually crashed. You don't water down the data that way. So whenever we hear 91% of cases are decided without interference from the family court, yeah, you're trying to water down the data by including information which is not relevant to the way the family court operates. Now, if we look at that 9%, which is a fairly high number, it's almost 1 in 10, then we see a clear fucking bias, which is worth talking about. This is just another fucking derailing tactic.
You know, that's one aspect. A separate thing I wanted to mention, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center, when talking about some of the men's rights movement stuff, when I think 90% of the violence against men is by other men.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we're not suggesting that 100% of violence against men is done by women. No one has ever suggested that. But it amazes me that apparently we're only allowed to talk about violence if it's gendered, right? If it's one gender against the other. Oh, and of course, if the perpetrator is male and the victim is female, right? That seems strange. Surely we should be able to talk about perpetrators and victims regardless of their gender. But apparently not. Apparently we're only allowed to talk about violence if it's gendered, with a male perpetrator and a female victim. And isn't it funny that if we look at the 90% figure he gave us, that means that 10% of violence against men is in fact with female perpetrators, which we never talk about. And he's talking about violence in general. He's not talking about domestic violence, which is what feminists tend to focus on. If we look at those figures, then it's around 40 to 50%, depending on the study. But yeah, it is true. Males are more likely to be victims of violence from other males than by females. And guess what? Men are more likely to be victims of violence in general than females in general. Yet we only focus on female victims. That's a bit strange, isn't it? It's also interesting that feminists tend to use female victims of male violence as evidence that society hates women and sees them as lesser beings. And, you know, it's male misogyny, dominating women and oppressing women through violence. Yet men are more likely to be violent towards other men, which would seem to contradict that argument, wouldn't you think? Surely if men are violent towards women because they see them as lesser beings, then they wouldn't be violent towards other men at a greater rate. It just doesn't make sense. And I think this is why feminists focus on domestic violence and not violence in general, because if you focus on violence in general, you have to admit that men are more likely to be victims. And the stereotype of a male trying to dominate a woman through violence kind of falls away. You also have to take into account that men are typically stronger than women, and that men typically are less likely to report violence when perpetrated by a woman. They're less likely to be taken serious, they're less likely to be believed, and we're more likely to ask the question, what did he do to deserve it? So taking these things into account too, the 10% figure is probably a little lower than what the real figure is.
Some of the rebuttals against you is like, hey, men suffer lots of violence, and nobody disagrees with that, but it's not mostly women attacking men. You know, there is some of that, that's fine.
Yeah.
But, all right, so why don't we move on?
I've come across a lot of really radical feminists who everybody rolls their eyes at too. So yeah. I think that there's a lot of comparisons.
But here's the difference between the men's rights movement and feminism. I do have a problem with radical feminists. I think that is counterproductive. But there are some important distinctions to make. First of all, I do not perceive those radical, harshly anti-male voices to be representative of feminism as a whole. I do perceive anti-woman voices to be representative of the greater part of the men's rights movement. And even though I reject their tactics and I reject their tone and I consider them overall to be counterproductive to the goals of the overall feminist movement, I get why radical feminists are so angry. I think underneath the anger and the reactionary stuff, I sympathize with them. I understand why they're so upset. I understand why they are so enraged against patriarchy, against male chauvinism, against male dominance of women in society. I get why they're so upset, because those things are real. And they're not just real for a few women. They're not just real for a small percentage of women. It's categorical. It's widespread. It's at multiple levels of our culture, all over our society, and in fact, well beyond our Western society, all over the world, and much, much worse than we have it in many other parts of the world. I get why they're upset.